So, welcome to Navigate Ed, where the pulse of advocacy comes alive. I'm Denise Marshall, parent, grandma, and COPAA CEO. Navigate Ed is hosted by the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates, known as COPAA. COPAA is where the movement for education equity gains its strength. We unite advocates of all forms to defend the civil rights of children with disabilities and their families, ensuring that no one has to fight alone. Across the country, many families are navigating a difficult education journey. Advocates walk beside them, attorneys bring unmatched expertise. Too often, this work happens in isolation. COPA changes that. We're a 3,700 plus strong network of parents, students, advocates, attorneys, and allied professionals. We connect and equip those on the front lines through structured learning, community support, and systemic advocacy. Navigate Ed isn't just a podcast, it's a call to action to our community, one that is driven by a shared commitment to unleashing the power of the law to transform lives. So today, we're really excited for a conversation with allies from the Council of Administrators for Special Education, or CASE. Here with us today are Kevin Rubenstein, CASE Board President and Assistant Superintendent for Student Services in Elmhurst, Illinois; Phyllis Wolfer, CASE Executive Director; and
Great.
Matt Cohen, COPAA Board Member and one of our founding members, a private attorney in Illinois. So thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Recently, CASE and COPAA collaborated on developing a set of common principles. Now, typically, some may not understand why this is we consider it to be a really important step. Typically, although parents and school personnel work very collaboratively at the IEP team meetings and through the process of the IEP development and implementation, when things turn to where there is a dispute, it can at times put our organizations, or the members of our organizations, I should say, on different sides of the table. So, although there are many examples of when our two organizations have collaborated at the federal level, many times we are also, again, on sort of seen as on opposite sides of issues or opposite sides of the table. So that kind of gives a little background into, why this may be seen as some to be surprising. For us, it's just very exciting. And I wanted each of you, maybe starting with Kevin and Matt and then Phyllis, to tell us why you feel it's exciting.
Matt, do you want to
Kevin?
go first and I can add?
Sure, that's fine. Well, I've been intermittently collaborating with Kevin for a long time, and actually we've had some situations that I think could have gotten very complicated that we were able to resolve. I think that the idea of collaboration is one that is easy to identify in hypothetical terms, but hard to actually promote and realize on a day-to-day basis without effort. And I would say in some respects, this podcast and the current effort between CASE and COPAA perhaps is long overdue in terms of developing a more intentional or deliberate effort at broader collaboration. But so one factor in all of this that strikes me as important is how can we as organizations promote collaboration on the ground for families and school staff to be able to operate more effectively. And then the thing that gave rise to this, which is happening to some degree in Illinois in terms of trying to respond, is that there is a horrible threat, a profound threat to special education in the United States and even to public education. And I think both organizations realized that this was a time, if there ever was one, where we ought to try to, in effect, leverage our respective constituencies and potential power and influence to make it even more effective in trying to influence what's happening in Washington. So I'm also very excited about the potential to work with Kevin and Phyllis and work with CASE as an organization.
That's really great. Thank you, Matt. I couldn't actually agree with you more. I think that time is right for our two organizations and really come together to work on some shared principles and to really help schools and parents and families to come together and to be a model for the collaboration that we hope to see all across the country at IEP team meetings and in school districts and in other places, to really understand that sometimes we are not going to see eye to eye on issues, and that's fine. It is how we do that and how we come together collectively to problem solve and to make sure that students, and especially those students with disabilities, have exactly what they need that really makes a difference. And so that's what I'm particularly excited about, is making sure that everybody across the country, as we come together to collaborate, really just understands the importance of collaboration overall and sees and identifies both of our organizations as problem solvers who are really here to make a difference in the lives of students with disabilities.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. And Phyllis.
So Denise, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good, good.
Here we go.
So I was having a little technical difficulty and I apologize. So thank you for the opportunity for us to join and to be together. We think it is so important as a professional organization, and for one who has been in the field of special education for close to 40 years now and working with leaders across the nation. It is so important that we continue to educate our school administrators and especially all of the new leaders that we have in the field of special education, in collaboration and working effectively with parents. So we're so happy to be with you here today, with you and with Matt, and of course our president, Dr. Kevin Rubenstein, and to share some additional information.
Great. Thank you. I mean, I think especially now with the current policy and funding and dismantling of the Department of Education and other threats to not only public education in our country, but also to students with disabilities and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, it's really, I think this partnership is essential. We are united in our commitment to the IDEA, to the support of students and protecting the rights of students with disabilities, and then strengthening, of course, families and supporting school personnel in this partnership. So, I think the very fiber of our nation's special education law is at risk, and we're proud to join you all in this effort. So I want to share a couple of the principles, and, for listeners who may not have had the chance to see them. And one of the first one is that public education is the cornerstone of a healthy democracy. So we are very committed to not only publication, but the second one is the free quality public education must be made available to every child and youth, regardless of a family's situation. And I'm going to just paraphrase, but that all participants, including parents and school personnel, should be full and meaningful partners, and that the federal government plays a crucial role in supplementing state funding and in shaping special education policy that ensures equitable access. So that's kind of a summary of our 7 points, but I guess the last is, at this moment in time, a very important one is that the U.S. Department of Ed should remain an independent agency that's fully staffed and funded to oversee federal laws, including IDEA and Sections 504. So, I think, again, this is such a powerful, powerful statement. And I was wondering, Phyllis, we'll start with you this time. Can you pick one or two that you want to emphasize more?
Yeah, I think when we talk about public education being that cornerstone, what we know when we talk about our charter schools and all of our public schools, over 90% of our students in the United States attend public schools. So we have a huge responsibility, not only as educators, but as parents, to work collaboratively together to educate those students. And when we think more specifically about our students with disabilities, and we think about the special education programs that we've been charged to implement in the schools and partner with our parents, it couldn't be more important for us to begin that dialogue with our two organizations, hoping that each of our state organizations and our local district organizations will see this as a true responsibility to dialogue and to have conversation in order to problem solve when we have some of those challenges that we're faced with, because the responsibility that we have is huge.
Certainly is. Thank you.
Mhm.
How about you, Matt?
Well, actually, I've thought about that question quite a bit. Which of these would I want to focus on? Because I see them as, in many ways, multiple legs of the chair, and any one of them taken away really undercuts the ability of the chair to stand up. But in one sense, the fifth principle, actually, which you didn't specifically highlight, refers to a free, appropriate public education. And in my mind, just the term free, appropriate in the least restrictive environment, but particularly the term free, appropriate public education captures a lot of the meaning of the overall principle statement, because we're committed to both having all kids have access to education, having it be free, and having it be appropriate. And so that covers equity, access, cost, and quality, and really says that it has to be related to the needs of the children. So that seems to me to be very powerful. But I'd encourage the listeners to look at those 7 principles, because they're all important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Matt, I would just add one thing when you talk about quality. And Denise, you mentioned at the very beginning about the dismantling of the Department of Education. And without that, I think sometimes quality can suffer, because we look to the guidance of the national federal office to assist us in interpreting federal law. And it makes sense that we have that office in place to assist our state education associations, that also assists our local districts. So when we think about quality, I kind of tie that piece together and think that is so important. Another big reason that our organizations need to be talking
Yeah.
and collaborating and having the conversation about how do we work together.
Yeah.
I would just add a quick point to Phyllis's, which is that another role for the Department of Education is to target and promote research, which is critical to both learning what instructional practices work and providing ways to effectively train teachers to deliver those best practices. So all of these things interconnect.
Yeah. And we're going to
Yes.
get to that in a minute in terms of the department, but I'm going to let Kevin get his
Yeah.
thoughts about principles in first.
Yeah, thank you. So I am really thinking of these principles as underscore on as a reminder about the federal law that we have all been working really hard to implement on a day-to-day basis for, coming up at the end of November is the 50th anniversary of the signing of Public Law 94-142. And before that, prior to that, students with disabilities didn't really have any of these rights or this belief about with disabilities being educated in the same spaces and in the same way that their general education peers are was not really a right there. And so when we think about public education being the cornerstone for a healthy democracy, that really hits home with me, because in many of the Supreme Court decisions that we've seen around education and special education, this has been enumerated a number of times. And then as we think about the other pieces here about the role that the federal government plays in terms of providing oversight and different states and making sure that the law is implemented at the state and local level is just so imperative. And so as I look at these, it just underscores the importance of IDEA as a federal law to make sure that all students with disabilities are being included to the maximum extent appropriate in their local public schools.
Great. Thank you. And yeah, bringing it, I think that's one of our for me, the big fear with the Department of Education closing is that we are going to go back in time. I don't know if anybody's ever seen the Rocky Horror Picture Show, but that time warp song.
Yes.
Yeah, it's running through my head, and I'm not
Yep.
going to sing it for you, but just going back that 50 years to when kids couldn't access or weren't seen as being part of the general education. Kids with disabilities are general education students, and they are, entitled to FAPE, as Matt said, very importantly. But they're also, when you're talking about quality, some of the prongs of that are that they're learning alongside their peers to the extent appropriate, as Kevin said, and that they're learning their grade level curriculum, or at least a modified version of that if that's necessary. And that, the Congress has worked hard for these 50 years to align the laws that govern and fund education from the federal government with the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is, of course, part of the elementary and secondary, or the new name for the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And although that doesn't really have rights and teeth in the same way that IDEA does, it does really give important information and requirements for how students are to be aligned. So, yeah, so there's just so many reasons in terms of why the Department of Education. I was speaking to a bunch of parents up in Connecticut on Sunday, and I said, "How many of you have ever used the either guidance or the letters that the department puts out, like letters to Cohen or letters to Wolfram, that explain the different laws?" And every hand in the room went up, because, and I'm sure the same is true of your members, that we look to that guidance, we look for those explanations. And if we can't find it, we had the ability to write in and ask and get our own letter. I was very proud of my letter to Marshall on issue relating to restraint exclusion. So, and that's been, at least right now, is taken away from us. There's only, as far as we know, maybe a handful of people left at the department. So, are there any other kind of reasons that anybody wanted to highlight in terms of, I know we've talked a lot about, already about 2 or 3 things that the department really does on a day-to-day basis. But what about funding? Are you guys worried about that?
About what?
Funding?
Sure.
Yeah, and so I think that is a piece that it's not only the funding that's provided to states, but it's also the funding. And we've collaborated on a letter regarding Part D of IDEA and the importance of some of the funding that comes through there. And there are things like parent training centers to make sure that parents are able to come to the table as full partners in educating their children with disabilities and making sure that they know how that should work, but also things that are going to help stem the shortage of special educators across the country, to make sure that there are people going into schools that are going to continue going into the field of special education, that there's good research that's put out there about this. And I think that the piece that really just resonates with me is making sure that everybody's on the same page all across the country. So regardless of whether you live in Texas or Illinois or Missouri or Connecticut or California, you are going to be able to access the same level of rights in your local school district as you would in any other place in the country. And there has got to be a federal role in protecting that.
Mhm. I think also along those same lines with funding, is the concern about the block grants. We have heard that from our colleagues, the Association of State Directors, that some of our state directors might not have, and the state departments of education might not have capacity that has been at the federal level to appropriate all of those funds appropriately. And when we think about how block grants have been disseminated in years past, it could be that different amounts of money will be flowing through to the states than what they have been accustomed to and what they're currently providing services based on net funding. So a lot of unknowns and a lot of things still up in the air with regard to the Office of Special Ed Programs and OSERS, and I think the U.S. Department of Education as a whole.
Yeah, and I think that chaos and confusion is what
Mhm.
biggest impact that we see immediately. Some of the other things, such as another reason we as advocates rely on the Department of Ed is for the data. Being able to look up is a particular state doing? How, are they in needs improvement or meets, and how does whatever issue we're seeing for an individual child fit within the systemic nature? Same thing with, restraint and seclusion and other initiatives, disproportionate,
The disproportionality. Yes.
right. Yes.
Yeah.
Discipline. I was trying to find the word
Mhm.
discipline for
Yes.
students of color.
Mhm.
Some of the things that data has illuminated for us that we've all been working on, that the law is very specific about, particularly that disproportionality and the use of 15% of early intervening funds to address it when that comes about. So what's going to happen, to all of those requirements of law as well, in addition, of course, to individual students? One other, I think, immediate thing that we've seen, and I wanted to then ask you all if there are other immediate impacts you've seen, but one is certainly around what you mentioned with the shortage of teachers. Many of our, that's something we recognize too, is that members are saying there's a shortage of personnel, whether it's teachers or paras or OTs or PTs or speech and language. And,
Right.
many districts are saying, well, we're not filling that right now because we don't know if we're going to get the funding for example, and this is not my area, so I might not have the details right, but I think the next time funding would come out is in July, somebody said. But
Yes.
if there's only 2 or 3 people in the office, how in the world could that happen?
Right. Yeah. And Denise, just to add to that, what we know about that is that it's a process. So it doesn't happen overnight, and it really begins in the next couple of months as states start to submit some of that data that you talked about and their state performance plans and annual performance reports and to the federal government for review. And the federal government typically plans their oversight and monitoring for, the next year and what that should look like and which states they should be taking a closer look at and doing some on-site work versus others that they feel like the state has some good things happening there and can really just be added technical assistance in those cases. And so I think that as it comes up, sure, schools are forward funded right now. And so we have our funding from IDEA for the school year, but there's a real danger in just allowing that to be our mindset because we really need to focus on the fact that this is an ongoing cycle. And when you stop the cycle mid process, you are just putting everything in jeopardy.
Yeah, and like I said, I was in Connecticut with a group of parents, and the state director of special ed was also there presenting. And he said, someone asked him the question. He said, "We know what our responsibilities are. We'll be submitting our data and we'll be doing our work." And that was, of course, great to hear. But I kept thinking to myself, but then what?
Yeah. Who
What's
looks at that?
who's gonna look at it once it's submitted? And
Yeah.
yeah, so I think there are a lot of questions. Are there other immediate impacts that others have seen, or things that you think might be coming down the pike?
There's both a local level impact and a federal impact that relates to the uh, passage of the tax credits for donations for vouchers. And the local level impact is that every time a public school student withdraws and enrolls in a private school, the public school loses the reimbursement that it would get from the state, whether they're a student with a disability or a student in regular education. So as the number of students who are being incentivized to go into private school increases, that's going to have an impact on local school budgets. And I think it's going to be slower and a little less obvious. But if the federal government, Congress has said, we're going to give $15 billion worth of tax credits to people for vouchers, it makes me very concerned that they're going to have $15 billion less to appropriate for public education. That's obviously, we're not at that cycle yet, but it's not an unlimited pie unless the Congress is prepared to say, oh, we're prepared to give public school as much as it had before. I suspect that's going to be at risk too.
Yeah, so that, and I could just fill in a little. So that's a provision that was in the, and I say that's tongue in cheek. It's hard for me to say it. My voice doesn't even want to, but as you can tell, the big beautiful bill that passed, and so it's a provision that's happening in January, and that states are to plan and figure out how the details of that tax credit will work. And of course, that is a whole another subject in addition to the loss of income, but also for students with disabilities and their families, the loss of rights that go along with moving to public schools, and then the disruption to services when if things don't work out and then they have to come back and start the process of eligibility all over again in the public schools. And I know that's, disruptive to the school system as well. So I don't know.
Mhm.
I'm sure others want to chime in on this one.
Yeah. And I think that the disruption in instructional programming, of course, is our primary concern. But there's also that piece that we hear from states that already have some voucher programs in place. We need to advocate for if it doesn't work out in the public school, and then the money needs to follow the kid back to the public school. And that's not what's been happening in states across the nation through a number of those voucher programs. So it's imperative that we stay on top of that, that I think our organizations continue to collaborate and advocate, you know, for those pieces when states begin to put that in place. As that continues to happen,
Yeah.
January or not, or who knows, right?
You're right
With some
now.
parents.
Thank you, Phyllis. I think that's an important clarification. In the states that do already have voucher
Mhm.
programs or tax credit TSAs, I forget what that stands
Mhm.
for at the moment, but yeah, it's a similar kind of forward funding that you mentioned that happens with the schools. So the private school gets the funding, at least this is the way I understand it, but they get the funding at the beginning of the year. Students start, let's say, in the end of August, and by September 15th, they're kicked out of the school, but the funding stays with the school for the remainder of the year, even though the child goes back to public school. Is that what the scenario that you're describing?
Yeah, that's what we hear from a number of our states. Yes.
For sure.
Yep.
For sure.
And so I would just add 2 points here. So the first point is we have not touched on the closure of OCR offices across the country and the impact right now that a federal shutdown is having on real students' civil rights all across the country, and an inability to problem solve and really work through some of those more difficult issues, some of which have been going on for very long periods of time and were moved from one office to another, one relationship investigator to another really overnight. And we all know that it doesn't work that way. And I think that the other piece about funding that is really important is that without federal funding flowing to the states, and that the states then funding local school districts, in my own school district, it's a very small portion of the overall budget, but even the loss of $100,000, which is far less than we receive in federal funds, has to be made up somewhere else from local dollars or from state supplements. And we know that's just not something that we're planning to have happen through, other means. And so that can't forget about just the impact of those federal dollars flowing to local school districts all over the country. So that's really just important, because people will lose access to services. We will not be able to fund our curricular programs. We will not, things are going to get worse in those situations.
Yeah, Kevin, thank you for bringing up the OCR issue as well, because I think that's another one where we are both concerned with that. And of course, with the civil rights of upholding the civil rights of students with disabilities and students of color and students, whose identities intersect in many ways. And we not only heard a couple of months ago that they downsized the offices from 12 regional offices and gutted half of the staff, to recently, within the last month, when these rifts happened, they went down to 2 regional offices, and we don't know how many staff. So, COPAA is involved with the National Center for Youth Law in a lawsuit on that issue. And I know the unions have also, have a lawsuit going to stop the reduction in forces. And so far, we have a stay from a federal judge, and which means that a permanent stay now. It was temporary for a little while, but that should the government reopen, and there are 2 different issues happening at the same time, but should the government reopen, they would not be able to fire those employees as they plan to do.
Yeah.
Now, that still remains to be seen as we move forward. But there are a couple of things we want to have people do, if possible. One of them, from our perspective, is if there's a civil rights violation happening, continue to file your OCR complaint. We cannot afford to see the complaints go down from 20,000 that they were last year to all of a sudden they're at 100, because we will know that the reason for that is likely that people didn't think anyone was going to investigate them. But it looks like, and would be certainly, some may say that there's no longer any concern. We close the Department of Ed and look at that. All the civil rights complaints were resolved.
Magically disappear.
We didn't need them after all, right?
Yeah.
That's what they would say.
Exactly. So please
Mhm.
do continue to file those complaints if there's an issue happening. And we also, one of our big reasons for working together, as you mentioned in the beginning, is to encourage people to be thinking about ways they can be collaborative at the state level, work out issues if you can for kids and families and personnel, everybody at the IEP table, and use our networks to ask questions to get clarification if there's an issue that's causing a team to be in dispute. And also, some of the things we've been pushing people to do are to sign on to our principles. So if you go to either of our websites, I'm sure you can find the link to do that. Anybody else have other ideas for what people can do right now that you'd like to chime in?
I'll talk about our action center on the CASE website. We do have an action center, and we talk about the importance of the U.S. Department of Education and to take action and to tell your congressman that we need that office. There are several calls to action at www.casecec.org, and just go to the action center. Kevin, do you want to add to that?
No, I think that it is really important for us to make sure that our voices are heard and that we are telling our members of Congress and using our relationship skills to reach out to elected officials to talk about the real impact of the closure of the federal government right now and about what each of these laws really means to each of us on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And I'll just say at www.copaa.org, we also have a button for take action under our policy work and have those same alerts there. So thank you, Phyllis, for that reminder. Matt?
Yeah. And I think I would encourage people to go to both. The more emails sent, the more that's telling our elected officials that this is our voice. This is what we believe. This is what we need you to do for us. So the more the better.
Yes, because under the law, they really can't close the Department of Education without congressional action. So
Correct.
and hopefully the courts will continue to be on our side to hold them to that, because some of these actions seem to be an attempt to end around the necessity to go through Congress. But there's nothing, I should have said this at the beginning, but let me emphasize it again. There's nothing in the law that has changed. And so the rights and the requirements under the law are the same. Matt, you've been waiting patiently. I think you probably
That's okay.
had.
Well, I think that all of the different ways that you can communicate to the Congress is desirable. And just to add one easy thing, and different people have different sort of preferences as to whether it's better to communicate by email or to communicate by calling. Actually, the Congress itself has a phone number that you can use, 202-224-3121, where you stay where you live and they'll give you the contact information for your congressperson or senator. The other thing that I'd like to really emphasize is that any person, whether they're the parent of a child with a disability, an advocate or lawyer, an educator, they have families, and their families are distributed all over the country. And this is something that really needs to be made a family issue, because the more people we have who are mobilizing to push to support public education and IDEA and the Department of Education, and then but the more pushback that there is so that the Congress is really aware that we're committed to these laws and programs and to the U.S. Department of Education, the better.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good point. And just a reminder to people that, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was passed as a bipartisan measure. It has always been bipartisan. It remains bipartisan. And so regardless of who you might affiliate with or who you're looking, if you happen to be in a state that's going into midterm elections, ask them about the issues, ask them about education, tell them what you want to see along those lines, and use that as a teaching moment, but also a decision-making moment for you. And as Matt said, for your families and for the other people that are voting in districts. So
yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We've given a lot. I would say, is there anything in closing that you want to share with people in terms of what to look for next, or for our collaboration? Or I know we don't have any specifics per se, as we each work with our organizations to think about this, but just any closing thoughts along those lines?
I would just add one thing quickly. Given the environment, and I typically say given the political environment in our nation today, I would just really encourage our listeners to be problem solvers, to resolve conflict, to do it in a meaningful, a collaborative, and a very human, kind way. We see so much unkindness, I think, in our nation and in what is occurring. And I want to give just a personal thank you to Matt for reaching out to Kevin, and for Kevin saying, yes, let's move this forward. Let's have conversation. These two gentlemen have started a movement for us as educators and parents and attorneys. And I want to really embrace that and continue to move that forward, because as a longtime educator, I can say I care about kids and I advocate for kids. And so thank you for taking that step.
Such an important point, Phyllis. Thank you. I know that it certainly has been a highlight for me, the meetings that we've been having, and just as I said at the beginning, the excitement about working together.
I would just add one thing, and thank you, Phyllis, for that comment. I encounter people and I struggle with the feeling myself of what difference will it make? I'm just one person, and how can I affect a situation where there seems to be so much happening and so much that's kind of happening quickly and too many conflicts to even pay attention to all at once. And I just want to reiterate that every action makes a difference. The more things you can do, the better, but any action contributes to an overall sense of calling attention to the issues we're concerned about. And the more actions that you can take in concert with other people, whether it's existing groups like CASE and COPAA, or forming neighborhood groups or PTA groups or whatever it is, all of those things contribute to a momentum and an empowerment of people where they don't have to feel that they're just alone, kind of blowing in the wind.
So I will just add one of Matt's cases earlier on in his career, I will say, is in my former school district in Lake Bluff, Illinois. And the interpretation now by the Seventh Circuit is still the law of the land, even though it was interpreted in the early 2000s. And Matt is going to continue to represent families in our area, and some of whom are in our school district. And I think that it is how we come together to problem solve and to collaborate that all of us on this podcast, and really across the country to the listeners, that we can, when we come together and talk things through and try to really problem solve, that maybe we can do a little bit better and more for our students. That's not to say, Matt knows this, and I've said this before, I still get a little heartbeat rise when I see Matt Cohen's name in my inbox, right? As a assistant superintendent, right? That's our relationship in the past. But I'm hopeful that someday, very soon, that I will just see that as another collaborator in our work to support students with disabilities all across the country.
Great. Thank you all. Kevin, we'll let you have that last word. So again, I really appreciate everybody's time. I know this is the first of many times that we'll be collaborating on something together to share out with our networks. So I look forward to that. And again, thank you all for being here today. I also want to just say to our listeners, join us next time for another lively and timely topic. Reminder to follow COPAA Navigate Ed on social media and visit our website. We're on Spotify and also YouTube at the moment if you want to follow our channels. And we thank you. See you next time.
Thanks.